Well, I actually wasn't going to mention anything about the Free Birth Society because, I read the very long, very difficult to read Guardian article, and I wasn't really going to record anything or say anything. But then I saw Rebecca Watson had shared a few things, and there was actually another creator who also had shared her view on it. So I thought it might be interesting or useful to share my own perspective about the Free Birth Society and what's been revealed about them. And because I used to run antenatal classes, so just a warning, I will be mentioning stillbirths, things like that. I will absolutely not be going into any gory detail, but I just wanted to mention at the start, if you don't want to hear about that, don't bother with me. So I actually trained as an antenatal teacher with the NCT, which stands for the National Childbirth Trust, who are a British organisation who do education and advocacy for new and expectant parents. Now, to do that, I had to do a fully accredited college course with the University of Worcester. That was lasted for 2 years. It cost me about £2,500. And so I used to run antenatal classes. And what sprung to my mind was a lot of people believe that the NCT are into exactly the same sort of thing as people like the Free Birth Society. They're perceived as being run by crunchy mums. They're encouraged to avoid medical treatment. They insist on a natural birth and make people feel bad because they had cesareans or whatever. Now, I've left the NCT, and I will go into why a bit later on. And also a warning, I think this may be a bit long. Look, I did a previous script and it was an hour, and I thought no one needs that. No one needs to listen to me for an hour. So I'm sorry about that. But first of all, it is completely true that the Free Birth Society and the NCT do share a common origin, and they do actually share a common philosophy. But the approach and the outcomes are completely different. So the Free Birth Society and the NCT were both born out of the natural birth movement. And I just want to define this because I don't think I have already. I think I've defined it a bit too late on. So I'm going to define it now. What is a free birth? A free birth is a birth where you give birth by yourself. That means you give birth far from any kind of medicalized environment. You don't have experienced birth attendants. So you may have a doula, but you wouldn't have a midwife. You certainly wouldn't have an obstetrician. And I will go into that in a bit more detail later on. But up front, if you're wondering, free birth, that's what it is. And it exists outside of simply this group of, well, two people called the Free Birth Society. As a concept, it goes back a lot longer than that. But they were both born out of this natural birth movement, which originated in the 1960s with people like Sheila Kitzinger, who in turn was influenced by writers like Grantley Dick Reed, which was a reaction to what had begun to be an extremely highly medicalized, interventionist, industrialized model of birth that started to be the default. So in the UK, even up till the 50s, births were usually at home under the supervision of midwives. And you only went to hospital if things were going wrong. But this began to change in the 60s. But this isn't to say that things were great before in terms of hospital births, and just look up the history of things like twilight sleep at the turn of the 20th century. And it's also not to say that birth was safer in the 1950s. What hospitalization and medicalization gave us was a vast improvement in reduction in infant mortality and maternal mortality. And that cannot be denied, and it should not be denied. But during this time, birth was becoming industrialized, and as a result, traumatic, way more traumatic. So interventions like routine episiotomies were commonplace. And if you don't know what an episiotomy is, you can look it up and you're welcome. And people had no autonomy. You couldn't refuse an internal examination, for example. And babies were separated from their mothers and put in communal nurseries and only brought back for regular 4-hour feedings. And this 4-hour cycle was not based on any medical evidence, but it was arranged to fit around hospital shifts. which in turn were based on factory shift patterns. But babies didn't know that, of course, and these routine feedings made breastfeeding very difficult. So if anyone tells you feed your baby on a 4-hour cycle, that's where it comes from. I mean, a baby's stomach at birth is very small and they need feeding regularly and often, regardless of the method of feeding. So in a midwife-led birth at home, you could move around, you're in a familiar environment, you could, once you gave birth, you could hold your baby, you could feed your baby, but in a hospital, you were strongly discouraged from doing anything. So I don't know if you've seen the scene in Monty Python's Meaning of Life, which I will link, but it's exactly like that. So Sheila Kitzinger had experienced traumatic births and had founded the NCT to campaign and lobby for people while they're pregnant, while they're giving birth, and while they're taking care of their babies. And a lot of the improvements to labour and maternity services in the UK can be attributed, at least in part, to the NCT. So it's just ensuring that people in labour are able to make choices about their treatment or lack thereof. So in the UK, if you're in labour, you can refuse treatment. You can say no to anything. I mean, I'm not saying that's a good idea because it usually isn't, but you do have that right in the UK. But this is still far from perfect. Anyone who's given birth in the UK, including myself, could completely confirm that. But the NCT train antenatal teachers, like I was, and doulas who are like an experienced birth attendant. And these people are trained to assist new parents in navigating pregnancies and birth and labour and beyond. On the other hand, the Free Birth Society seems to simply extract money from people, vulnerable people, and return give them absolutely nothing, and in fact has been linked to several baby deaths. So, as I say, free birthing is giving birth all by yourself, and I have been aware of this for quite some time. And some people just do it by accident. But the first named individual who started advocating for it, and there have been a few knocking around, a lady called Janine Pavati Baker. Other people have tried to encourage free birth and have been arrested after they were linked to stillbirths and deaths. But often these are people who are working as unlicensed midwives. It's a bit hazy as to whether they were actually actively advocating for free birth. And around, I think it was around 2022, 2020, so these grifters turned up. They're called Emily Saldaya and Yolanda Norris Clark, and I feel that they have a psychopathic lack of concern for the effects that they have had on people. So they seem to be coming from what is like the crunchy mum to MAGA pipeline. Numerous people have said this. I'll say it myself: is you scratch a hippie and you'll find a fascist, and that's what they are. They don't believe in gravity. They don't believe in germ theory, which is, you know, that kind of person. So strongly encourage you to read the Guardian article. So they were selling courses at several $1,000s ago. They had a big forum. They had many thousands of people who were members, but only a few seemed to actually be pregnant. And the courses, I just keep eating my hair. The course is purported to teach you how to free birth your own baby or attend other free births. And what's also important to note is they began to aggressively tell people to reject medical advice they were told. They're telling people don't have scans, don't have blood tests, don't have any antenatal checks whatsoever. And I think they call that a wild birth. And when you do give birth, you must do it as far away from possible. And anyone who might be tempted to give you any help, you are encouraged to surround yourself with like-minded people who in turn aren't supposed to help you. And this is where it starts getting terrifying, and it's clear that this is a scam and or a cult. As a result, some people were giving birth in the middle of nowhere, either alone or with a few like-minded people who had no idea what they were doing. The founders are recorded as advising people who contacted them immediately after giving birth, who were concerned that their baby wasn't breathing, to bear in mind these calls cost several $100s a time. What should I do? And they were told, oh, just sit there, don't attempt resuscitation, don't call an ambulance. If your baby wants to breathe, they will. And you can imagine how that has turned out for some people. Other people have been labouring several days, hadn't made any progress, and they were just advised to carry on. And if you have given birth, if you've experienced labour, you can imagine what that was like. Now, that did remind me of a case in 2000 where a woman, her name was Inez Ramirez Perez, and I believe she still does, lives in Peru, performed a cesarean on herself after, I think it was a 12-hour obstructed labour. And she performed a cesarean on herself. Can I just repeat that? And she said afterwards, that, I quote, "I couldn't stand the pain anymore. If my baby was going to die, I decided I would have to die too. But if he was going to grow up, I was going to see him grow up and I was going to be with my child. I thought God would save both our lives. And I feel, even though what she did was drastic and inadvisable, she lived an 8-hour drive from the nearest hospital, and her actions feel like a much more understandable reaction in desperate circumstances than doing nothing." And going back to the NCT, I would like to underline very strongly in several different colours that here is where the NCT and the Free Birth Society completely diverge. As a teacher, we were drilled so very thoroughly on warning signs and what parents should do if they are worried about something. And I'll divide these differences into sort of categories. So the first of all is high risk, and it's acknowledgement that pregnancy is high risk. Even a straightforward pregnancy is a risky business, and sometimes a pregnant person can go from completely fine to catastrophically unwell very, very quickly. Pregnancy can make underlying conditions become hazardous or more hazardous, and not to mention physical vulnerabilities and the emotional risks from the pregnancy, and then being presented with a tiny human that you must now care for. The second thing is alone. Now, humans are not creatures that give birth alone. So I just came back from South Africa and we went in a nature reserve and we saw a water buffalo give birth, which was very magical and messy. So this was the matriarch of the herd, and she's in charge of where they go, what they do, what they're going to destroy next, because water buffalo are not, they're very large and aggressive, but not that bright. But we could see she was in labour, and we saw the rest of the herd were still there. They were looking out for her. They were keeping respectful distance, but they were looking out for her. They definitely had not left the leader of their herd to go and labour on her own, because they knew how vulnerable she was and how vulnerable the calf was going to be. And it's not that different for humans. We don't give birth alone. Now, I'm not going to mention evolutionary psychology because that's bollocks, but you look at human history, you look at anthropology, and you can see humans give birth usually with 1 or 2 experienced attendants. And no culture, to my knowledge, has ever encouraged people to give birth alone because it is risky. You look at mythological stories, they feature midwives, they feature births, and they show that people have always needed this assistance during their birth. And I mean, pregnancy and birth are less risky now for most people, but in the past it was the main cause of death for adult women. And we as humans have always recognised that this is a risk and understood that this was lessened by having other humans to help out. And in the past, this would have been people who had attended other births and they'd passed down their knowledge. It might be a mum, it might be your sister, it might be someone else in the village. And gradually this evolved into the profession that we know as midwifery. And the next thing is just a physiological issue, which is humans have large heads and a proportionally small pelvis in order to facilitate bipedal walking, and our big brains. And part of the price we had to pay for that is longer and more difficult births that need assistance. And I feel like it's very ironic that you can tell people they don't need any help, they don't need any professional assistance, they're fully empowered to give birth by themselves, and then selling them a course for several $1,000s in order to show you how to give birth unassisted. That would be funny if it weren't true. And I do hope that actually that paradox deterred a lot of people from fully subscribing to this philosophy. Instead, the Free Birth Society say the mother is fully empowered to give birth, and your baby is apparently also fully empowered to know when to be born, how to be born, and again, terrifyingly, how to breathe and whether or not to live. And like I said in the previous video about conservative movements, they just resort to lying and outright denial. So when they get challenged, they just say, no, we didn't mean it. Haha, we don't mean that. We're not giving anyone any advice. And I feel like, it is in fact worthwhile trusting someone who has trained for years and gained qualifications and probably knows what they are talking about, just as general advice as a rule. But they also talk, as I say, they talk a great deal of nonsense. They don't believe in germ theory, they don't wash their hands, they don't believe in gravity, they're flat earthers, just any kind of wacky conspiracy talking point you can think of. And also they encourage you to exclude anyone from your life who doesn't agree, which is, again, the hallmark of a cult. someone in your life says, this seems like a bad idea, your baby might be hurt, you might be hurt. And the thing is, babies have definitely been hurt. So there's no way to know for sure. But estimates suggest that something out of the few dozen people on the forums who were actually pregnant, 3 or 4 of those babies unfortunately did not make it, that the Guardian could find. And that's actually a level of mortality you can see in places like Sierra Leone. Now, I know about the maternal mortality rate in Sierra Leone because of John and Hank Green, who funded the building of a maternal centre of excellence in Freetown, Sierra Leone, almost entirely by the selling of socks like these. So this centre and other actions like more training have managed to reduce the maternal and infant mortality rate in Sierra Leone. So in campaigning, they shared some stories about women who are in full-on active labour, borrowing a neighbour's bicycle to travel the 25 miles to give birth in a hospital because they'd seen what happened to their friends or their relatives who give birth with no antenatal care and no expert assistance. So it's not just infant mortality, but also complications such as fistula and other physical effects on the mother after long obstructive labour. Now, fistula can be extremely distressing and they're stigmatising. Women can be ostracised and excluded from their community because of an obstetric fistula. And the worst thing is really that these are easy to prevent and easy to treat. So it did strike me as astonishing that the Free Birth Society have managed to convince women who do have access to antenatal care, relatively easy access to medical help during their labour, to reject all of that, to experience a birth similar to somebody in Sierra Leone, which is crazy because if you'd seen your mother, your sister or your friends have awful 6-day-long drawn-out labours with catastrophic outcomes, why on earth would you choose that for yourself? So going back to the NCT, it's been caricatured in the UK media sometimes as a bunch of out-of-touch, wealthy, white middle-class mums trying to encourage other people to give birth, no pain relief, compulsory breastfeeding for all, no epidurals. And because of this, the NCT is responsible for the atrocious state of the UK maternity wards, or some UK maternity wards. And this is absolutely not true. But it is funny to me now to read how the Free Birth Society have been doing exactly what the NCT has been accused of doing. They've been telling people to give birth without any medical help or any kind of intervention. So the thing is, I did leave the NCT in the end, but not because of any disagreement I had with the philosophy, but rather to do with how antenatal teachers were treated. So as a teacher, you're freelance, so you get trained at your own expense. You become a freelance teacher and you get paid for the time you teach. So I taught my blocks were six lessons, 2 hours each, and then a reunion at the end after they've all had their babies. So one of the problems was I was expected to drive all across London to teach courses, and the pay was not amazing. So it was above minimum wage for the time spent teaching, but in terms of the additional preparation, it wasn't. You also had to, you were given a small kit featuring, it had a baby, a pelvis, some posters and stuff like that. But all your other resources, you expected to fund those yourself, make them yourself and fund them yourself. And you don't get paid for any of the prep time. You didn't get paid for travel time. You did get mileage, and you also didn't have to pay for renting the venue. But other than that, you're on your own. So, if the venue didn't have tea and biscuits, you had to bring those yourself. So this expectation also was that you would market and do your own marketing for your own courses and also research your own venues. And that's a lot of unpaid work and actually a lot of time spent traveling around, again, unpaid. So for every 2 hours of paid work, I think you'd put in at least an additional hour in prep, not to mention the travel time. So at the end of the initial course, I was asked my feedback and I said, I really enjoyed the course. I had some really good friends, but if you'd asked me whether I thought it was worth it, I would have to say no, because looking at the amount I will actually earn, I would have been much better off doing an accountancy course. And that did seem a little sacrilegious because a lot of the other people on my course were exactly the kind of people you are picturing. There were dungarees involved, and I'm not going to criticize vegans, but quite a few of them were also vegan. How do I know? Well, they all regularly reminded me that they were vegans. So, and I never felt that I fitted in that well, probably because of because I am a skeptic and that sort of thing. But I felt the course was valuable, but there was this kind of very MLM vibe to the course. We did do a lot of learning about birth, physiological aspects of birth, but we also did a lot of stuff about personal reflection, which I felt wasn't necessary. I didn't need to know my learning style or my Myers-Briggs type, which we had to do that, if you can believe it, to teach antenatal classes. So the final straw was you get assessed on a regular basis, which is good. And I'd also like to say, if you're pregnant, thinking about booking an NCT course, to it. I mean, it's really useful. You do make friends and the information is incredibly useful. But and I also found NCT classes very helpful for myself. When I gave birth, it was I could share a horror story, and I won't, but I didn't find it as traumatic as I could have, and I think that was partly because of the NCT classes. But anyway, this assessor came to observe a class, and then afterwards she started talking to me about NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming, which is a pseudoscientific, pseudo-psychological nonsense thing. And I just shut down at that point when she started to say, oh, you need to think about this, do this in the future. So then I came to renew my license to teach, had to fill in this very long, complicated form all about my feelings. And I called up my tutor and said, I'm not going to renew this. And she said, why? I said, because I had this conversation and I was just like, I can't do it anymore. So I just felt like I cannot deal with people who are in a position to grant or deny me a teaching license who subscribe to things like NLP and nonsense like that. I just can't. And I said, you keep saying you're evidence-based. But anyway, that's the kind of people that used to be at the upper echelons. I know it was in a process of change. There was also some resentment between teachers who'd qualified under an older system where the NCT just kind of trained them themselves rather than have their course accredited by the University of Worcester. And the older teachers really resented that. They wouldn't talk to us, they wouldn't work with us, and that was really obstructive and frustrating. Anyway, so yeah, I enjoyed it when I did it, and I really appreciated having the privilege. I said it was a privilege to deal with expectant parents, and that was really good fun. But I don't regret it, but I did leave, and I don't regret leaving. Anyway, I'll finish with an anecdote which I thought was kind of funny and relevant. So a few years ago, I needed some CPD points. I ended up at a thing called the Festival Ideas, which is run by Living Marxism. No, sorry, not Living Marxism, because Marxism didn't pay quite as well. Spiked, who are now a libertarian, contrarian magazine. But so it's funny I fell for that. But anyway, I need the CPD points, and there was a panel on birth and child welfare, and I thought, oh, I'll go to that. That's my CPD sorted out. So the panelists, I can't remember most of them. I believe the Moral Maze's Claire Fox was one of them, but they were laying into anyone involved in child welfare, social workers, anyone involved in trying to give people choices, support parents, including choices when people give birth. And they were extremely libertarian in the worst way possible. And at the end, I put my hand up and I said, if you're so, and they were really anti any kind of quote natural birth. Absolutely not. I said, if you're so keen on freedom and liberty, why on earth are you trying to enforce your view that everyone should give birth lying in their back with an epidural? Surely, and I said, surely women, which was about 2014, if I had said people in a place like that, I would have got lynched, absolutely. Surely women having choice during labour and birth is a good thing. I explained then that I was an NCT teacher, and then one of the panelists, not Claire Fox, a different one, spent 5 minutes laying into me personally as a representative of the NCT. She said, you're exactly what the problem is. We know how to parent our children. We don't need anyone to intervene. We don't need anyone to interfere or tell us what to do. Parents should be absolutely sovereign. And that's one of the first things I thought of when I started reading about the Free Birth Society. They do think they're sovereign. They think they're sovereign over their bodies, that they can somehow prevent negative outcomes from birth and from pregnancy by sheer force of will. And that's not true. And, it's not a failure. It's not a failure when a labour goes wrong. It's not a failure to seek help. It's not a failure to seek help from someone who has no experience than you. It is not a failure to respect the fact that people have studied and learned. So you can see my microphone stopped working. But all I was just about to finish what I was going to say, and I was going to talk over myself, mouthing nothing. But I was going to say that, yeah, the system surrounding birth in the UK and the US can result in some very bad outcomes. And a lot of people would prefer to have as intervention-free a birth as possible. But the solution to that is to improve the systems and the infrastructure and enable people to access a stress-free home birth, midwife-led, if that's what they want. But all too often that simply isn't an option, and there is no reason why not. So I was just going to finish up to say those are my thoughts on the Free Birth Society, and I feel this is a bit of a darker tone for me, but again, this is something I've worked with. I've studied it for quite a few years, and I thought that sharing my perspective would be worthwhile. So I'm going to link the Guardian article and the other videos I think might be worth watching below, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I did try not to say anything that would upset people, that I'm not really dead inside despite how it may appear. I do know people who've had really, really awful experiences, and these can be horrific. And the one thing I'd say is, if you're planning on having a baby, the best thing you can do is prepare yourself, be aware of what's going to happen, and I wish you well.